you'll notice in your programs that Alysa Procida was also meant to be here today. Actually, very happy news. Alysa has since, in the past month, been appointed to the director of the Inuit Art Foundation. So her new schedule didn't allow for her to be here today. So some of the things that I'm going to be talking about are things that are really sort of her area of expertise, but I've been at the museum now for about 2 years, so I know a little bit. So I'm going to try and cover as much as I can. This isn't quite up to date with my PowerPoint presentation, so hopefully we don't get too lost. So, coming of age, young museums, non-traditional spaces, and collections at the Museum of Inuit Art. When we saw this borderland idea for this presentation, Alysa and I started thinking about ways that our museum sort of exists in a borderland. And there's many different ways. Museum of Inuit Art that's in Toronto, of course, there's a border between north and south. But I think the most interesting one, and the one that's caused the most issues for us, is our sort of institutional history as being founded from a for-profit gallery and being turned into a non-profit museum. So I'm going to sort of say some sort of taboo things we're going to talk about today, which is sort of the when the boundary gets blurred between non-profit and for-profit in terms of management. So in order for that to make sense to you guys, I'll run you through some institutional history. So the Museum of Inuit Art, where it is, on Queens Quay West in Toronto, was actually originally, in the space that it was in, was a gallery called the Harris Gallery. The Harris Gallery was founded by a man named David Harris in 1999. And so the story goes that David and his wife had lived in the north as teachers, and when they were there, they were exposed to Inuit art. And when they came back down south, they really saw a market in Toronto for an Inuit art gallery. So they founded this art gallery, and it was very successful, and it dealt high-end artwork, like top-of-the-line stuff that was very expensive. But of course, Inuit art in Toronto, you have people who are interested in it but aren't necessarily familiar with Inuit culture. So you start to see educational displays creeping their way into the gallery space. So there's some information to say about transformational imagery in Inuit art, and maybe a video that gives you a biography of a certain artist. And then there sort of starts to be this want to establish a museum as well. So the gallery will remain and continue to sell art, but beside it is a museum of Inuit art, where there's museum pieces and a display and a collection and tours maybe and educational things. And of course, the gallery will continue to sell pieces to support the museum. So in 2005, the museum is founded, and it opens in 2007. And when it opens in 2007, it has, so that photo's not in there because it's not my updated thing. You have to imagine that it's the most magnificent architecture you've ever seen. Just imagine the most fantastic Arctic landscape indoors, which is what I'm told it was meant to resemble. So it's white walls that are really faceted and angular, and it's quite striking. So that opens up. So, of course, with this boundary between nonprofit, a nonprofit museum that works side by side with a for-profit gallery, you're going to see some sort of blurred boundaries. And there's many different ways that we can look at those blurred boundaries, but just for the purposes of time and for I can't say it. I'm going to just talk about collections because I'm also the collections manager there. So in this arrangement of the gallery supporting the museum, there are risks and there are benefits. So one of the risks is, of course, is that you have very high-end gallery pieces being sold to people who are collectors, because the Inuit art field has a very established community of collectors and lenders. So the same people that are purchasing from the gallery start lending their pieces to the museum. And then, because it's really, the gallery has always been on sort of the cutting edge and selling the top of the line pieces, you start to see an overlap between artists that are featured in the museum and artists that are for purchase in the shop. So just say you have an Uvalu Tunali piece in the museum and you have a very similar, if not identical one, in the gift shop. So then you run into these issues where you can actually kind of put a price tag on things that are in your museum. And of course, this is confusing to the public, and especially to people who are museum people like us. But there are kind of a few benefits. So the thing, we're making a lot of money from the gallery, so that's good to support the activities of the museum. And there's already an established clientele, so you already have sort of visitors to come in and talk about your space, and people who are interested in Inuit art who want to go into that museum. And also, because there isn't a clear distinction between what is the gallery and what is the museum, the space can sort of evolve and sort of morph. So sometimes museum programming can take over more of the gallery space. So this is sort of the setup for the institutional history. So we have someone who's very successful at selling things, who wants to also establish a museum. So you start to see issues with a management that has previously been profit-driven, trying to run a non-for-profit museum and trying to uphold certain standards of care. So the first thing that we're going to run into is inventory control in collections versus retail. Picture this. If you're having a gallery that is supplying top-of-the-line, very expensive artworks that are really museum quality, and you have a museum next door, you're not really going to be getting those pieces from different sources. So the pieces for the museum and the pieces from the gallery are coming from the same place. So they're coming from the same cooperatives and auction houses. So at this time, the museum collection is assigned a simple M number. So when, just say something was purchased using acquisition funds, it comes on an invoice, and then we write M1, M2, M3, M4 on that invoice. And then those invoices, the numbers are all stored in a binder. And the numbers are really only associated with the works through a tombstone label, and there's no location tracking. So what I've seen in the past is that in order to associate a piece with its name or number, you just do what you would have done in the gift shop, which is take a piece of masking tape and stick it on. So we remember that that is a Nunapar bear. So the retail inventory is not much different. It's a sequential numbering system beginning with I. And these invoices come in again, and you start to assign it I1, I2, I3. But actually, it's a little bit more clear which pieces in the gallery are which, because they actually have these Avery labels stuck on them, and no location tracking at all. So if you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable, that's okay, because this is sort of, we're going to talk about things that are uncomfortable. So we have some definite issues with distinctions between what is gallery inventory and what is museum inventory. So we start to see this no man's land because we didn't have a very robust collection system or records even. We didn't have cataloging records during these early years. So that sometimes pieces, like in present day, you pick it up and it has no number associated with it, and it's unclear whether or not it was meant to be in the museum collection or in the gallery for sale. So I hope you're all feeling like this right now. Try to lighten the mood. Also, in addition to our less than ideal record keeping, there are some conservation concerns. So I told you to imagine this magnificent building that looks like an Arctic landscape. What I haven't told you is where that is located, which is at right on Lake Ontario in this beautiful historic building. Beautiful is, a subjective term. It was North America's first poured concrete building, the Terminal Warehouse. It was a warehouse on the waterfront. And it's been around for a while. I actually don't, late 1800s, early 1900s. And then functioned as a warehouse and was renovated in the 80s to be sort of this new space. So what you see happening on the right is a retail concourse is established on the lower floor. Above that are offices for different companies, and above that is condos. So it's this mixed-use building with a lot of things happening. And we are right on the main floor with all of the other retail outlets. And that's a lot of people in one building. And what happens when you get a lot of people together is they get hungry and they want to eat at restaurants. So we share our space with several restaurants. Across the way is Watermark Irish Pub, and right above us, spanning the entire length of the museum, is Pearl Harbourfront Cuisine, which is a Chinese food dim sum restaurant. So we have some issues there. We have these beautiful windows that span the length of the museum, and this was a picture taken at night where you can look in and see the sculptures inside. So this is a historic building, and I can tell you that when the wind blows really hard in the winter, it blows through those windows because they're very poorly insulated. So it's very difficult to maintain any sort of environment, whether it be temperature, humidity, or light. And also, the fun thing to know about these windows is that they are meant to open up into the park. And my understanding is that originally architects wanted some sculptures to be outside because they're stone and they can survive outside, that you could walk out to, which we keep them closed. We've never had them open, but across the way at Watermark Irish Pub, they have these same windows and they open them up in the summer for the patio, which means that birds come inside, and the entire building is filled with birds. So you can see this atrium, and it is full of birds at any given moment. And Alysa and I, so Alysa, of course, has taken on this new position, so we've been working on this remotely together. And she said, especially with a giant body of water right outside the doors. And only now am I realizing she wasn't referring to the 4 giant fountains outside our lobby, but probably Lake Ontario. But we also have these fantastic bird baths outside the museum, which are fountains, and I can tell you that as soon as we get a classic Toronto humid summer day, they algae bloom, and they smell horrible, and they're green and slimy and disgusting. So obviously we have some environmental issues happening there. Trigger warning for pests. Obviously, we're going to have some issues with pests. So I told you about the restaurant. What I have not told you about yet is the fact that we also share that first floor with the Sobeys, which means that our loading dock, which all of our large, heavy artworks come through, is also shared with the Sobeys. So you could be seeing like a head of lettuce and some compost as you're transporting fine art. So obviously, we have some issues with pests. They weren't... As far as I know, there wasn't a very significant system for monitoring them in the past. Also in this building, shared building with lots of different people, storage is at a premium. So this was actually quite a nice idea, which I think is sort of the story of the museum, which is like, in theory, it would be nice to have a museum, but maybe we should know a little bit about best practices first. So I think someone saw open storage at another museum and was like, we should have some of that. So open storage was installed. Check out those sideways shelving units that go about 20 feet up in the air, and you have to get the tallest ladder to get to the tallest shelf. But storage is at a premium not just for the gallery, not just for the museum, but also for the gallery. So these storage spaces were actually used for overflow for gallery pieces and museum pieces, which contributes to our issues with record keeping. Inside, so here you can see a little bit of our beautiful architecture. We have two types of cases. We have these glass ones and these plexi ones, and neither of them are sealed. So it's impossible to keep pests out or control any type of environment inside. My favorite thing are these plexi cases on the right. They're involved to be sort of unobtrusive to the viewer. That's the way they were designed. But of course, to make that design, you actually lift them up from the bottom and lift them up over your head. So don't worry, the architects thought about this, and they gave us aluminum poles to prop up the plexiglass with while you install objects. So very safe. I hold my breath every time. So there are beautiful views, and everyone tells us to be so thankful that we work in such a beautiful area. And in the summer, it is nice to see boats, but also when I'm roasting alive through the plate glass windows, or in the winter when the wind blows through. So it's not ideal. So these are some issues that the museum is facing when it first opened. So we have someone who's incredibly successful with running a retail operation who endeavors to open a museum with the best of intentions, but maybe doesn't prioritize museum best practices, because after all, they run a very successful gallery with pieces that you can't really differentiate with the museum objects. So at this point, as I said, just the gallery is what is supporting the museum. And because all of the priority is put on the gallery, often the gallery is prioritized over the museum because there's a very financial and very visible sort of value to the gallery that you can't see in the museum. And what does the public think about this? Well, I know what I would think about it, and it's not very different. So we got this lovely TripAdvisor review once that said, "Is this a museum or a gift shop?" And I think that's fair. This was in 2012, and I think this is clearly still good programming was happening at the museum at this time, and there certainly were staff who were concerned about these issues that we're talking about, but overall I think it sort of becomes muddled in the public's perception. So we're getting a little stressed out about this, but things are going to look up. In 2013, Alysa Procida, who couldn't make it today, took over as executive director and curator. And that sort of marked a time in a sort of where priority was put on museum best practices. And my favorite fact to tell everyone is that now we have 3 students who graduated from the, well, they're not students anymore, from the U of T Masters of Museum Studies program, who are working at this museum. So it's really the great experiment to see if we can survive as museum studies students. We also have a museum studies student from Algonquin, I believe. So we all of these overhauls start to happen when Alysa started because we needed to step away from the gallery as a gallery space. Something had to change. So I'm actually going to go to this slide first. The first thing that happened was that we had to create a clear distinction between the retail gift shop and the museum collection. So now I call it a gift shop, and I've actually been really careful not to call it that so far. So it was always referred to as the Museum of Inuit Art Gallery was our gift shop area, and then there was the Museum of Inuit Art. And so we, with the sort of branding of this space, it was very clear that we needed to call it the gift shop and no longer the gallery. We didn't, unfortunately, we didn't want people to come here for fine art sales anymore because it was sort of devaluing what we were doing as a museum. So there's now a distinction between how the two inventories are dealt with. And actually the gift shop started to sell a lot different materials and started gearing themselves towards a museum gift shop that really focuses on what the average museum visitor can walk away with rather than a fine art collector. So we have, and I actually really stand by a lot of the products we have in the gift shop right now. We have wonderful books by Inuit publishers and mittens made by women in Nunavik, and they're really just more appropriate to the space. The museum collection becomes much more distinct with a trinomial numbering system, and there was a clear distinction between temporary pieces, loan pieces, permanent collection pieces, education pieces, and we recently established a research collection. we have a beautiful dedicated filing cabinet, and we actually have online software, open source software that we use called Collection Space. So there's a paper copy and a digital copy of everything in the collection. So a little bit earlier I showed you that seal who was looking sad and said, "Who am I?" So it wasn't enough just to give everything a number again. Clearly, our problems ran deep. And what I sort of am a little frightened when I realize how messed up things got in a 6-year period and how confusing everything got. And if it would have gone any further, how much more muddled everything would have been. So Alysa saw this and proceeded to go through a comprehensive collections audit where every single piece in the museum was looked at and sort of retroactively given a robust history. It took, I think, actually a little bit over a year. And so Alysa began to undertake this, and obviously she couldn't do this all on her own. So collections volunteers were brought in, and that's actually where I started as a volunteer, cataloging things. And we literally had to go through and find every piece of every detail on anything. This involved actually reaching out into the field a lot too. So talking to different collectors, talking to people from auction houses where pieces might have come from, and actually tracing their original owners, or speaking to cooperatives, because there's a large cooperative system within Inuit art. And so we actually were quite happy with the data that we were able to recover. And so now each object has its own history and its own file, and we're quite pleased with that. So things are looking up. And I kind of like this because, thrift shop, he's going through the inventory. But so obviously those conservation concerns I talked about earlier are still issues. We are still in the same place, but how we deal with those is different. So when we have a little pest friend that shows up now, we actually have an integrated pest management program that is implemented. And that little mouse that I showed you, these are all, it's not even all of them. For one day, for an entire week, every day, there was a dead mouse in the middle of the floor. And we couldn't figure it out. And we think that maybe someone at Sobeys had laid out poison, and then we had this wonderful, open concept, all of, the pipes and stuff were exposed. We think they were running along the top of the pipes and sort of just falling over and dying. But we wouldn't have been able to figure all of that out if we hadn't been carefully documenting and photographing dead mice. So now we have much more happy things happening with our collection. So that sort of involves me. So I was hired to specifically attend to the needs of the collection. We are a very small museum, and maybe smaller museums don't have that dedicated individual, but I think at this point we had sort of dug ourselves a hole and we needed to really kick into high gear. So all objects that are no longer on display are not in that wonderful open storage area anymore. They're actually have been moved off-site to a climate-controlled storage facility. We also have been really made sure to ensure objects are being stored with proper materials and techniques, so things are no longer masking taped to an object to make sure that it remembers its number. Things are properly numbered. And this also involved a huge overhaul of policies and procedures. And then, of course, policies and procedures stipulating how long particular materials should be on display. We don't want to have a wool wall hanging on display in the museum up there for about 2 years, I think one was up there. And then me. So very slowly but surely, we're getting happier. Revenue sources and budgeting. So if before the gallery was where all of our money is coming from, and we are no longer selling pieces in the gallery like we used to, where are we going to get our money? So we now work with a model that is more reflective of multiple funding sources rather than relying solely on fine art sales. So we also reconfigured staffing priorities to include a development coordinator, and when I say we, I mean Alysa. and someone who could focus on membership and annual drives, including grant applications, with success. So we actually received a MAP grant this year to upgrade our collections management system from the cloud's open source collection space to the museum system, and I've been working on that these past few months, so we're really excited. And we've also increased our focus on expanding educational programming and institutional partnerships. So not bad. So public perception. So are we a gallery, or are we a gift shop, or are we a museum? I don't know. But this person said where size does not matter. And you know, they only gave us a 4 out of 5, but I chose this one specifically because they featured photos in the bottom there in their review of our Stories from the Vault exhibit, which is how I want to end this presentation. I was kind of picturing a smaller room and a more intimate group when I was coming up with this presentation. That's why it's a little goofy. But I have some things that I can pass around, or if you guys want to come up to the front afterwards and have a look. So ultimately, all of these really exciting changes and ideas were happening at the museum, but those were, of course, behind the scenes. There were exciting things happening in the museum as well. So like I said, there's different lenses to look at this sort of confusing boundary between gallery and museum that we're really trying hard to get separate, further and further apart right now. There was a recuration of the space in 2013 as well. But I think that sometimes you want to share the work that you've done, and there were honestly so many incredible discoveries that came out of all this collections audit and this overhaul of everything that we wanted to be able to share it with our visitors. So we actually came up with this exhibit called Stories from the Vault. And there's a little Ukpik who was a detective who actually went through, and you sort of went with Ukpik in this exhibition and uncovered all of these clues about pieces in the museum. And there were so many stories, and obviously in order to tell stories, we needed text. And there was simply, no one was going to read it if I put it on the wall. So I made a fake little dossier for the detectives to carry around with them. And so you had to match up the clue number with the case number and then find it in your booklet. And then once you did that, you would uncover the story or a little activity to do. So they were divided into 4 different categories. So I'm just going to talk about this for fun as we wrap up. So the first case was Whodunits. I don't know if you've ever discovered something in your collection that maybe, especially if you work with art, who did this? That happens a lot with Inuit art, like a lot, because things are coming from north to south and maybe have been around for a few years and with a collector and it hasn't been signed. So again, this was if I walked by it, I really like this piece. It's called Birds on Branches, and it was always said it was artist unidentified. And when I actually pulled it out to catalog it for the first time, we found very interesting things about this. Number one, all of the birds were numbered and all of the branches were numbered. So presumably you would put bird 3 with branch 3, but that was not the case. And not only had they been put in the wrong spot, someone had glued them together. So you could tell that they were in the wrong spots, and then they were glued into the wrong spots. And then we realized that these are actually birds made by different artists. So we actually went out into the field and got some expert opinions, and we're actually able to identify, we believe there are 3 different artists featured in this piece, and we were able to identify 2. Please don't ask me right now who the artists were, because I don't have them right off the top of my head, but I do have the case file with me if you want to have a look. There was the paper trail. So these were all of the incredible mix-ups that happened with our paperwork. There's these 2 Amoutis right here, and honestly, this was the story of what happens if one thing gets misnumbered one time. So I would have swore that the one on the right was T1.1.2006, but after careful detective work, I discovered that it's actually the one on the left that was named that, and I cannot for the life of me figure out where the Amati on the right came from, and no one else can. And this involved taking pictures of the gift shop. This Amati was displayed in the gift shop, the sort of silky one, and I was able to zoom into those photos so far that I could see that it said "not for sale," and said the name of the artist who made it. So I know it wasn't for sale in the gift shop, and it was there as some sort of educational piece, but I do not know why it's there or how it got there. But needless to say, we have this at our museum. If it's yours, call me. Cracking the case was about, honestly, just the cool stories that happen. This piece right here is called Journey to the Cruise Ship Loiba Verlova, like it's a self-portrait by the artist Matuzi Yatuk. Matuzi Yatuk made this self-portrait after he visited an Arctic cruise ship called the Loiba Verlova. Pretty simple. But what was uncovered during sort of cataloging of this piece was that the Loiba Verlova cruise ship had actually been decommissioned shortly after Matuzi had visited it. And then it was sold for scraps. And when it was leaving a harbor in St. John's, Newfoundland, the cables broke and the ship sort of drifted off into the ocean. And the internet had a big field day with this, and they were actually tracking the location of the ship as it sort of was a ghost ship on the seas. And then it became, the stories got more and more fantastical. So there were stories that there were rats sighted on the ship, and then people were, guessing, well, like, what could the rats be eating but each other? So there were all these internet articles about the cannibalistic rat ghost ship. And we have that piece. And this piece is so serendipitous. I have had people come into the museum and tell me they were the chef on the ship or they were on its last voyage. Like, I can't wait to hear the stories that come out of this in the future. So finally, the most exciting thing that happened during the collections audit were some discoveries of fakes and forgeries. This one isn't a very good one, but it's a really interesting story as well. So on the right is a piece that was never actually displayed in the museum. It was used as an educational piece, but at closer look, it is totally fake. It was made out of a mold. You can see the mold lines. It was made out of some sort of plaster and then painted to appear to look like soapstone. And then I could see the brand of what it was made with. So when I was researching this, I Googled the name Aardvark Canada. I Googled it, and I found an identical one on Etsy for $20, and I bought it. And so they both went in the Stories from the Vault show together, and so the piece that was an educational piece got its time to shine in a case as a fake piece. And we actually were able to do some fun programming about why fakes and forgeries exist and how they're done with these pieces. So that's it. That's sort of my favorite part that came out of this collections audit, was this small exhibit. And for sure, come and talk to me if you want to see the case file, which has all the information in it. And this is for Alysa, who is a big fan of Kanye West. Thank you.